Okay, I'll do that again because somebody intruded and the slide stopped presenting. Okay. Can you see the slide now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so this is my presentation today, translation in the language space. So let me start with an introductory note because this is going to be quite different from the kind of discussions that were presented by the previous people who were there before me. So this is about what I mean by translation. First of all, I'll discuss in the language space. The particular focus here is on the use of translation for language teaching and learning at a higher level, which means at the tertiary and the university levels, which concern a majority of audience here, because most of us teach at this higher level of either colleges or universities, post-secondary and university levels. So how we can use translation as a pedagogic tool in the language learning space. Now, once translation used to be a glorious method, and in the present times, not until the last 10, 15 years, translation has almost been outspaced or at the maximum occurred peripherally for language teaching and language learning purposes. Now, once a very popular methodology in foreign language, second language, and other language classes, translation was completely segregated from the language classrooms from the 1980s, so far as we are concerned as teachers in our career. So this discussion will focus on the causes behind its early popularity as a language teaching method, then its complete eclipse as a method starting from the early 80s till the first decade of the 21st century. Now, a wider acceptance of translation as a pedagogic tool in language teaching and language learning has become a very recent phenomenon in about the past 10 years or so. Henceforth, I'll simply mention language teaching, language learning to refer to foreign language, second language, or other language teaching and learning. This is a time-saving mechanism for me and for all of you. Instead of repeating this FL, SL, and OL, teaching and learning, I'll just mention language teaching and language learning. The language could be in, language in focus could be for people, it could be French, it could be Sanskrit, it could be English, it could be Oriya, Tamil, or Japanese. Any language that is taught and learned as a foreign language, as a second language, as an other language. And this discussion is not for first language teaching, obviously, because first language teaching methods, they start quite late in a person's life. Teaching methods, first language learning starts from birth, but teaching methods start quite late. And the methods that are used for second language, foreign language, or other language teaching do not suit so much the first language teaching methodology. So that's what I wanted to introduce the topic in that manner. And this is the structure of this presentation. First of all, I'll discuss the role of translation as a language learning, language teaching device over the ages. It's been there for quite some time. Then the next point in focus is translation, its origin, rise, and decline in language classrooms. Now, its present status in pedagogy, how it has made a comeback, and how it's used as a pedagogic tool in present language classrooms. And please remember, by language classrooms, I mean at the foreign language or second language or any other language. Then finally, some discussion, some focus on the applications of translation in language classrooms at post-secondary and university levels. So this is generally the structure of this presentation. Now, first of all, we start with the structure, the role of translation. Now, translation has been used in language learning and language teaching as a very old practice. This use has been supported and opposed during the intervening centuries from the time it started. Yet translation as a means of second language, foreign language, or other language teaching and learning has never lost its significance. This strategy can be successfully utilized by language learners to make effective cross-lingual comparisons at different stages of language learning. For example, learning by linking new expressions and vocabulary items in another language to the learner's mother tongue equivalents is a conscious focus by adult and young adult learners of languages. This is a more effective strategy than learning vocabulary in context for adult learners particularly. The rationale for this discussion can be established for the present time when proficiency in other languages has become crucial for life situations. As everyone knows, this is common knowledge. All of us know about the needs for language proficiency in many different languages. Because nowadays youngsters and adults, they go for jobs in many different countries, even inside a diverse country like India, where many different languages are used. So for purpose of jobs, travel for various purposes, could be business related, could be it could be for relaxation, it could be a family meeting. So travel for various purposes. Even in the present times, marriages between people speaking very different languages. For example, an Odia speaking boy marrying a Japanese girl. So how does communication happen if the Japanese girl is proficient in English and the Odia boy is proficient in English? So what happens? So this is the kind of translation activity. This is why we need translation activity in language learning spheres. There's again some problem with my connectivity.
No, ma'am, you're very much audible.
I'm audible? Okay. But I can't go to the slide. Okay, all right. So then I'll focus on the origin, rise, and decline of translation in language classrooms. Origin of translation, rise of translation, and decline of translation in language classrooms. If we talk about the journey of translation as a language learning tool, it was sometime in high fashion, sometimes blown away, and its position and use in the 21st century in language teaching and learning space is going to be quite stable now. So for so far as the origin is concerned, in the modern times, the first translation course in English, which was mentioned as grammar translation course, because there was a lot of focus on grammar in this kind of teaching courses. So the first grammar translation was published in 1793, and this followed a model of a course in French published in 1782. So it's in late 16th century that this grammar translation method started. This method used translation to and from foreign languages of different individual sentences, which were usually specifically constructed to exemplify certain grammatical features of the language to be learned. This meant that the examples could be graded for difficulty and that the grammar of the language learned could be taught in a systematic manner. And the grammatical constructions that were chosen in this process, they were ordered in terms of difficulty, from simple to difficult, from simple to complex. And they were presented in structured sentences, which were quite artificial. The learners would study the grammar of a foreign language or a second language or a different language, and they used literary and religious texts to stabilize their language learning process. They also used dictionaries and grammar books. Now, for 2 centuries, this remained an adapted method of language learning in many different Western countries. Now, this method received high accolade in England in 1858. That was the year when a system of public examinations was established, controlled by the universities of Oxford and Cambridge. These examinations served to fix Rindan, will you please ask?
Yes, ma'am, I'm trying from my end.
Rindan, somebody is trying to mute me again and again.
Yes, ma'am, I'm searching for that.
Okay.
Ma'am, please continue. Yeah, I'm
Okay,
looking up.
so when we discuss the rise of this method was received, this method received public recognition in England in 1858. And that was the year when public examination system was established, controlled by the universities of Oxford and Cambridge. These examinations serve to fix modern languages firmly on their curriculum, along with the classical languages. Previous to that, only Greek and Latin came as classical languages. They were taught as foreign languages in these universities. So now these universities realized that modern languages should have the same academic responsibility as classical languages. Therefore, they understood that modern languages were to be taught like the classical languages principles. So they adapted the same methodology for modern language teaching in 1858, 1860s, as they used for classical language teaching methodology. The basis for institutional learning, thus for languages, thus started in the format of the structure of classical languages. This methodology became consequently necessary for at least 200 years for modern language structures to be understood through classical language structures. And therefore, the necessity of translation rose in the language learning space. Then came a phase of decline. Objections to translation were initially raised in the late 19th century. And they were largely reiterated in the 1960s and 1970s, mostly by researchers who believed in the direct, natural, and communicative methods of language teaching and language learning. These communicative approaches to language teaching challenged the so-called translation method, with a heavy focus on grammar, structure, and constructions. That was devised to teach modern languages in the format of classical languages. So there was a lot of objection to this methodology by researchers, practitioners, classroom practitioners, and educationists. The effectiveness of this translation method was brought into question on the theoretical grounds, first of all, by Henry Sweet and Otto Jespersen. the movement was based on two fundamental principles. And each of these principles ran counter to the grammar translation method of teaching. Jespersen and Henry Sweet, they propounded the primacy of speech because the translation method focused on writing being primary. But now, in the direct method, in the communicative approach, there's the speech became primary. And the importance of connected texts in teaching and learning, not isolated sentences, not with the focus of structure in sentences. Now, the severest blow to this method came from such language teaching methods, as I mentioned, is natural method, communicative method. They are all based on the philosophy that learning a new language cannot be organized in a step-by-step manner, which is quite irrational to learn a language, first this, then this, then this. It sounds quite illogical because language learning happens all together. So this was the philosophy of the communicative approach and the natural method. So they proposed that language learning is rather an intuitive process for which human beings have a natural capacity. And this capacity can be triggered only when proper conditions exist. So what happened during the late 1960s? There were anti-translationists, if I may call them, and they propounded and recommended that translation should not be used in classroom practice for language learning, because translation cannot be a substitute for language practice. And translation is unnecessary to develop language competence. Now, see, this is what we discussed just now. So, objections to translation as a pedagogy tool, the decline of translation as a pedagogy, they were raised with the communicative turn to language teaching. The communicative approach to language teaching gradually used to such an extent that translation lost its importance as a teaching tool. Now, there are, of course, negative values of translation in pedagogy, which has been discussed by different theoreticians. And I'll focus on some of these a little later. So there are certain disadvantages, as I mentioned, and advantages in pedagogy if translation is used. Research is quite divided, but at the present time, the translation as a teaching tool, translation as a higher level language development equipment, it's gaining quite a lot of reputation and quite a lot of people practice that in the classroom. So in the latter half of the 20th century, translation occupied rather a controversial role in language teaching and learning and was not considered essential. More recently, however, an increasing number of cases have been made, increasing number of research studies have been made, more balanced examination of the use of translation in language learning at higher levels. So these are some of the advantages and disadvantages that I'd like to discuss. Now in translation, the first disadvantage is it encourages thinking in one language, transferring the thought into the language to be learned, language that is practiced to be learned, and that creates a lot of accompanying interference. The second one is the translation happens to be independent of the 4 language skills, which define language competence. But that's not quite clear how these people, how these researchers claim that translation doesn't have the writing component in it, and how is reading component is not included in translation. When we translate a text, very much the abilities and competence of reading and writing both are used. Now, another disadvantage mentioned in research is translation deprives teachers and learners of the opportunity of working within one language. So they learn through another language, which is a major disadvantage. Mostly they learn through their mother tongue. So they transfer the habits and the expressions, structures of the mother tongue onto the language that is being learned. Now, another disadvantage mentioned in research is translation gives false credence to the naive view that there is such a thing as a simple word-to-word equivalence between languages. Languages are quite different. So if in the translation process, learners develop this attitude, this idea that translation is a simple procedure. One word is transferred from one language to the other language. It's just a word for word process, creating an equivalence. So that can be a disadvantage for language learning if translation is used. Then the last one that I've mentioned, there are many more, but I've focused only on the major ones. Translation doesn't facilitate the achievement of foreign language teaching aims. Now, one of the major foreign language teaching aims is fluency in spoken language. Now, translation does not facilitate creating fluency in the spoken language. So these are some of the disadvantages discussed in literature. Now, the advantages of using translation as a pedagogic tool in the classroom are quite a few, and some of these I have mentioned here. So through research, we understand that learning a foreign language, learning a different language is not like acquiring the native language. So the processes will be different, but there are a lot of similarities in language learning in general. Language learning by human beings, it follows a certain process, and it's not very different when we learn the first language, we learn the second language, or when we learn a foreign language. Then research advances this proposition that translation allows for conscious learning and control of the foreign language. Therefore, it reduces interference. Now, when young adults learn a different language, they learn a new language, and they're advanced in their learning stage, they can notice consciously the distinctions between the two language systems, and they can control and reduce the interference of their first language, and the transfer from first language to the other language, the language being learned, the transfer will reduce considerably, because it has been noticed through research that adults and young adults, they consciously focus on learning and control the language structures. And conscious learning also creates automatic habits in the language skills. Now, when the learners learn consciously, a lot of habit formation happens. They practice, and they consciously understand what they are going to use. So they create a lot of language habits in the new language. And when language habits are formed, that leaves out space for meaning. So conscious learning through translation creates habit formation. A lot of habit is formed so far as structure, spelling, and all these things are concerned, and linguistic elements particularly, they're concerned. And then a lot of mental space is left with the learner to negotiate meaning. So that is one big advantage of using translation as a tool. Now, finally, everyone has a pre-knowledge. Everyone is born with, if people are born, after babies are born, they start gathering knowledge about their context, about their surroundings. So this system, this condition of pre-knowledge exists in human brain when they start, they look at the texts, then look at different languages. So human brain understands context and learns, therefore, make use of this pre-knowledge to create meaning both in the first language and in the other language that they learn. So the process of translation facilitates rather than rather than creating roadblocks in the path of language learning. So there are disadvantages that have been pointed out through research, advantages also that have been pointed out through research. So what happens then when aligned to these observations that I mentioned here, advantages and disadvantages, I'll offer a structured overview of the most common objections and counter objections, which I've already presented. And I'll derive a balanced position which can corroborate if the time has arrived to reintroduce translation in the language classrooms as a constructive language learning tool for learners who may grow to be future linguists, translators, particularly at an advanced level, and efficient users of a different language. So what could be the proposition if we reintroduce translation as a pedagogic tool? So translation revived as a language pedagogy in the 1980s. It slowly reappeared in the language classes when researchers, educationists, and classroom practitioners realized the ways in which they could actually use translation as one of the communicative techniques and activities. Translation was out of the classroom when this communicative approach arrived. Then in the 80s, researchers studied how translation can be a communicative tool and how translation can foster communicative activities. So gradually translation found a stable and consistent place in these language classes. So arguments that favor translation now, they propose that translation is a natural and easy comparison between the target language and the native language. It facilitates coding of difficult target language structures and elements, and it is also an effective comprehension tool. So these are the things that people, researchers have come across and people have used in translation. So there are also further arguments that translation for comprehension becomes a natural process in learning foreign language, other languages at the university level. So whatever teaching method is used, foreign language learners and foreign language users, they tend to translate anyway. So this, the process, the translation process doesn't leave the human brain when one gets across a communication block. One reverts to the mother tongue, one reverts to the language that one is fluent in, and then some kind of translation starts. So Before I take up the role of translation in language teaching in the light of the various positions adopted by both linguists and translation theorists, uh, now linguists and translation theorists, they now propose how this theoretical divide between the communicative approach and the translation method, which was earlier, it seemed to be irrevocably different approaches. And translation seemed to set language learning apart from the reach of normal average language learners and language users. Now research says how this translation and language learning divide can be easily overcome. In fact, they show that there exists a considerable overlap between communicative learning strategies and translation strategies. So some of these we'll discuss here when we discuss translation as a pedagogy tool. Now, research defines translation as a text-induced text production activity. So there is one text and that text induces the production of another text. That is the basic translation activity. So the source text induces target text production activity. We can create parallels with the communicative approach here. When somebody listens to something in the same language, here when we talk about translation, two languages are involved. But when we think about the communicative approach, it happens mostly in the target language. So when somebody listens to something, one gets ready for production. When somebody reads something, there is also a lot of possibility for production through either through writing or through speaking. Suppose a student reads a text, then note making probably happens or summary writing happens. So text-induced text production activity can also happen in classroom as a pedagogy tool. And also in the present times, for the last more than 50 years, researchers established the use of first language as a resource in second language and foreign language classrooms, which clearly implies the role of translation. When first language is used to teach or learn a different language, foreign language or any other language, first language is a support. So first language sources are used to understand the other language features. First language resources are used as scaffolding for constructing other language sentences or texts. So the role of translation has started for a long time in other language or foreign language classrooms. And this process of translation is highly interactive and highly communicative. One interacts with the text. Before translating, one interacts with the text. And a lot of complex activities accompany this interaction. What kind of complex activities? First of all, there is reading and there is interpretation. Because language can be ambiguous. One of the major qualities of language is its ambiguity. So one interacts with the text, trying to unravel superficial meaning, internal meaning, different layers of meaning, and the purpose of the author. So this is a highly interactive process, which is parallel to the processes involved in the communicative approach. Communicative approach is also interactive, highly interactive. Between people, a person and a text, text to text, lot of different kinds of interaction. And translation as a process is highly, therefore, communicative, just like the communicative approach. The text communicates to the learner and the learner communicates with the text. So that in complex interaction happens. before the actual translation process happens. Now, when the translation happens, then again, more of interaction and more of communicative function between two languages. So there is the translator there as the reader, the translator as the interpreter, the translator as the meaning accessor and meaning creator, and the translator as finally the role of the his role as the translator. Then as a pedagogy tool, the use of translation helps the awareness and conscious reflection on all relevant language features. When adults interact with texts, they become acutely aware of the differences the other language texts provide in front of them in comparison to their mother tongue or their first language. And they consciously reflect on these linguistic features. So this interaction is full of awareness and full of conscious reflection. They look at linguistic features, they look at stylistic features, they look at other associated factors when they try to get the production of the text in the target language. So the target text, before even somebody starts to translate, a lot of complex interactive and communicative processes happen, which are parallel to what happens in a communicative approach in language learning and language teaching. So if we look at translation as a text production process, now those who are aware of translation theory, even peripherally, there's nothing new here. I'm just expressing what is there in the text production process in translation. So first of all, the translator sets an amount of time because he or she has that amount of time to produce a target language text. And this time must fulfill the specific purpose for a specific readership in a specific spatio-temporal setting. So even if we say that communicative language teaching is a free procedure, if we look at the approach, it's also bound by the same limitations. There is a set amount of time in which we conduct our communication, we interact with people, we read and write in the communicative methodology, we produce something, whatever kind of text, we produce something for a specific readership and in a specific context. Then the target text has to be based to a great extent on another text, which is the source text, which exists in a language other than the target language. It exists in the source language. So there are two languages to negotiate. In communicative approach in the present times, the first language and the second language, third language, other language, foreign language, whatever language, there is always an interaction space which is allowed. Just like in translation, there is a source language and there is a target language, and there is a transfer from source text to target text. More or less similar things happen in a communicative approach when first language becomes a pedagogic tool in the communicative process. Now the source text and the target text, they have specific purposes to fulfill for a specific readership. Now, if I give you an example, now I'm sure most of you have come across or read A Doll's House by Ibsen, Henrik Ibsen, a Norwegian author who wrote the play in the Norwegian language, A Doll's House. Henrik Ibsen, and the language it was produced is in Norwegian. When he wrote this, women's liberation was not so much in practice, and divorce was out of question for a woman. A woman can never think of divorce. A husband can divorce a wife, but a wife cannot divorce husband. That was not accepted. But in that play, He wrote about the Norwegian society where it was when it was opening up, and women were considering liberation in different ways. But its first production was in Denmark, Copenhagen, and it was translated into Danish for that production. That was the first production. It was never staged in Norway as the first production. The first staging of this play was in Denmark, Copenhagen, and it was translated into Danish. When the audience saw this play, there was so much uproar that the staging was stopped. Staging was to be stopped after a certain period of time. The audience simply did not take it. So that's what I meant when I mentioned that the source text and the target text, they have specific purposes to fulfill for a specific readership in a specific spatio-temporal setting. So that is the communicative approach. That's the essence of the communicative approach as it happens in translation also. Now it so happened that that Ibsen had to modify the ending of the play. His original Norwegian and the translated Danish, they were not the same when at the end. So he had to modify. Otherwise, there was no chance of his play to be staged anywhere in most of Europe. So then the purpose, the readership, and the settings of two texts may not always quite the same. So the purposes could become different, the readership will become different, the settings will also become different. As I mentioned, as I get the example of Ibsen's Doll's House, this arises out of this proposition that source text and target text have specific purposes to fulfill. Just like in the communicative approach, the source and the target, they have to fulfill specific purposes, and more or less the same approach, the same techniques they are used to teach these communication skills to language learners in the communicative approach. So translation as a text production process is not very different from the communicative approach. The divide seems to be superficial rather than internal. So now translation is defined as a text-induced production activity, and its relevance as a pedagogic tool, it has become quite widely accepted. Translation has come to be seen increasingly as a complex process. It's not a simple word-to-word transfer or expression-to-expression transfer. Seasoned translators understand that the process is very different and process is extremely complex. And it involves a variety of skills together with cognitive skills, which are the building blocks of translator intelligence. If we can, I can use this terminology. I've never seen this terminology used before. So the translator develops a kind of intelligence, a communicative intelligence using a variety of cognitive skills. Now, what is the communicative intelligence of a translator? The whole process of translation entirely reflects on the process of communication. In real life contexts, as we have said, we have to set the amount of time to interact with people, to transfer information, or to express emotions. These are the basic requirements of communication. We use specific linguistic terms and expressions to match with the audience, our listeners or readers. Our audience could be our listeners or our readers. So this forms the background of communicative language teaching. So at the core, the process of translation is as communicative as the communicative approach to translation. Sorry, communicative approach to language learning. So when we talk about translator intelligence, we also have to take into cognizance the communicative intelligence that is used as the translator intelligence. So translation can be used as a scaffolding technique in language learning, in language classes. When the support of the first language or the mother tongue, those can be used to support the learning of the other language. Translation can focus consciously on the linguistic aspects so that these can be learned with much less effort. So translation forms a functional aspect of the communicative intelligence as well. So learners, the scaffolding technique and there is also, along with the scaffolding technique, there is another practical issue. It has been argued that translation of the source language into the target language induces learners to make errors because they come under the language habits of the mother tongue or the first language. It's also claimed that translation stimulates negative transfer of mother tongue features onto the target language. The counterclaim asserts that translation helps to overcome and neutralize negative transfer due to the conscious focus that attends the translation process. Empirical observations also exhibit that negative transfers attributed to translation also occurs when learners produce target language texts without using the native language, as happens in the communicative language communicative language teaching. So learners use only the target language. Very late, the first language is used as a language learning tool. So learners produce target language texts without starting from their native language, but still there is negative transfer because the first language habits, they are so deeply ingrained that unconsciously learners bring on this first language or the mother tongue linguistic elements onto the language they are learning. So translation cannot be made the culprit, the lone culprit in this. It's the function of human brain to take support of whatever resources the person has in the process of communication. By applying translation, therefore, consciously and systematically, learners can be conditioned and helped to monitor this kind of negative transfer. So, from 1950s to 1980s, grammar translation approach was used mostly in India, although the theoretical advances mentioned to the negative. But this approach was used in language teaching, which focused on teaching decontextualized sentence level grammar. So as I have already mentioned, with the approach of the communicative language teaching, this method went into a decline. Some research indicates that this grammar translation method did not improve learners' communication skills either in speaking or in writing. And for this reason, from the 90s, generally the communicative approach came into language classes and learners started to learn how to use a language appropriately in different social situations. Their oral fluency also significantly improved. But unfortunately, the learner's accuracy in communication, particularly in writing, declined considerably because there was no focus on the grammatical structures, no focus on sentence construction. If meaning was conveyed, that was accepted to be an efficient method of communication. But if people use language at a higher level in their jobs for different other purposes in the society for communication purposes, if accuracy lacks in adult language, that becomes a big problem. It becomes a huge setback. And the focus on form teaching approach made an entry into the language classroom in the last 15 years. It's a very recent phenomenon when language teachers, language learners, and educationists consider this shortcoming to create a negative impact on communication. And there's new research on focus on form, and the new approach offers students sufficient opportunities for authentic communication through the focus on form teaching approach. And this, in addition to fluency, this is seen to be improving the grammatical accuracy of the students' outputs. Focus on form provides teachers with a number of teaching techniques in order to improve students' grammatical accuracy in communication. So one of these teaching techniques is translation. So these techniques include input flood. If we use translation, we can have a lot of input, which is in technical term, it's technical terminology. We call that input flood. Then task essential language learning, where there is a particular category of task which focuses on a particular essentials of language. That comes in contextualized texts, where learners consciously, they look at tasks, they understand the features of language, and then they start producing a new text on the basis of what they consciously learned and discussed. There is input enhancement. If we use translation, there can be input enhancement. There's no dearth of texts in the other language, and a lot of input enhancement can happen. And a variety of ways input processing can also happen. So these are essentially communication, essentially activities with communication focus using contextualized natural use of language. So it's not sentence level, it is text level. It is not decontextualized, it is contextualized. And there is no dearth of input, a lot of input, so that a variety of tasks can be accomplished on the inputs, developing the natural fluency of language among the learners, and also at the same time the accuracy. So this can be conscious awareness about the other language being used, being learned. So based on a wide range of research used in this presentation, focus on form seems to help learners enhance their ability to use grammar accurately in communication, and at the same time to be fluent in their writing. When there's accuracy in grammar, their writing becomes fluent. They can focus on the content part. Now, if they struggle with the grammatical accuracy, content takes a backseat. It becomes a casualty. So a focus on form approach using translation can be applied as a strong version of communicative language teaching methodology, which uses task-based instruction and content-based instruction. Using translation, we can also create communicative teaching, task-based instruction, and content-based instruction. There are also other communicative aspects of the translation process. Many different communicative aspects are there. So while one is dealing with ambiguities, since language is a case of ambiguities, there is no language production which is without ambiguity. So there is ambiguities in language. So unraveling and dealing with ambiguities, processing with ambiguities in a connected text, in a contextualized text, while trying to translate that text from one language to the other language. This is an interaction, this is an interactive procedure dealing with the communicative aspect of learning, or while understanding contextualized meaning. So meaning of isolated expressions and words, meaning of contextualized words and meaning expressions can be quite different. For example, out of context, yes means agreement and no means disagreement in general, generally speaking. Yes means agreement, no means disagreement in general, out of context. If put in context, yes can mean disagreement and no can mean agreement. So this is a communicative process in unraveling the meaning in the context. So these are involved in the process of translation to produce an acceptable translated text where meaning has been properly negotiated. So these are all high-level complex language skills, and translation courses ensure that these skills develop in learners through sufficient practice. It's not that one translation is given in 2 months' time and we expect learners to interact with the text, use all high-level interactive and communication techniques, and to understand the text to produce a different kind, produce a text in the target language. That's not possible. A lot of practice is required in order to make learners aware of the linguistic and the meaning components of a text and to negotiate text in a communicative manner. So when we want to use translation as a communicative approach, we must think about a theoretical framework. This cannot be used randomly. A lot of failure of the communicative approach happened because it was not sustained by a theoretical framework. It was as suits any one approach. It gradually became that. So if we want to use translation in the language space, to use translation for higher level language learning, a theoretical framework is essential. So we must create a principled theoretical framework. So translation as a teaching activity should concern itself equally with the process and the skill of translation. So the theoretical framework must address these two dualities and bring about a combination of the two. The first one is the process and the second one is the skill, which are quite communicative in their theoretical perspective. The second, that the theoretical aspect in translation pedagogy should be the end product. As with the end product, it should be concerned with the end product because students benefit even from merely working towards a solution. So even if the end product may not be satisfactory, the teaching activity must be concerned with whatever product the students produce, the learners produce, so that a lot of feedback can be received from the products. So for many learners, the final product of translation remains less important compared to the process, compared to the method of translating, compared the method of negotiating for language, negotiating with language, and negotiating language for meaning. So this is the process, this is the work which they remain more concerned with. It's been seen through research that the end product is not very important for a majority of learners. Some are quite careful about the end product, but many are more concerned with the process. Now, useful activities in classroom translation should also explore areas of language through contrasts between the first language and the other language features that the learners are going to learn. There should be enough useful activities on this. Among the most relevant areas that these activities may focus is the use of common colloquialisms. Learning the other language is to master the colloquial aspects of the other language. And to master these, a variety of texts can be used, and a number of different types of translations might be used there depending on the context. Secondly, there are ideas rooted traditionally in the source culture or in source folklore, which may be rendered in different ways in translation. For example, by attempting a communicative translation, or by replacing the cultural denotations with a near equivalent in the target culture, or by opting for explanations. These are some of the means. And these are all communicative approaches. Replacing the cultural denotations with the denotation that is equivalent in the target culture, or using explanations. All learners through the communicative approach use these techniques. And thirdly, contrastive grammatical patterns which differ in the two languages, they should be made relevant to provide insights into the divergent linguistic structures of the two languages. The first language structure and the language to be learned, the other language structure. So the contrastive patterns in grammar, they should be focused to the learners so that they understand how language structures function in the two different languages, where parallels can be drawn, where transfers will be positive, where parallels cannot be drawn, and where transfers will be negative. So on the basis of the theoretical and practical perspectives, a model for teaching translation, specifically from the first language into the target language, or it could be the other way around. So if a model for teaching translation in the instructional context, like in universities and higher education institutes, it can be developed where translation is used both as a teaching learning tool to enhance target language competences. It can also be used as an assessment tool to evaluate the target language abilities. Both can be used. When I was in school, and many of you will share this experience if you are my age, those who are of my age, but most of you are probably quite young, translation was used to evaluate target language abilities, transfer from first language to the other language. So that was used as an assessment tool. So I didn't discuss assessment in this. It was only for teaching and learning purposes that this we require a very strong methodological principle and a strong theoretical framework. If we feel convinced that we should use translation as a pedagogic tool in our classrooms for language learning purposes, language teaching purposes. So there are also Baker's proposition of 5 types of equivalence. They can form one kind of theoretical basis where there's equivalence is word level, above word level equivalence, grammatical equivalence. But this may not always be true. So the theoretical framework also must look at the aspects where equivalences are not available. Equivalence is not possible. And in such a theoretical framework, the linguistic and structural competences, they will coalesce with the communicative competence. That should also be a prime responsibility of the theoretical framework for using translation for classroom purposes. Now, there are certain principles of translation as a teaching learning method that can be summarized, which I discussed here. So this is a kind of a summary of what the main points of the discussion. So there is an emphasis on the study and translation of written texts in an other language in higher level language courses. If we use translation in the pedagogy as a teaching learning method, so study and translation of written texts will be emphasized. That will need to be emphasized. Then there can be a comparative analysis of students' native language with the language studied, language going to be acquired by the students. Students, they should focus upon the grammatical paradigms of the other language so that along with their fluency, accuracy also develops. So we cannot have excuses for accuracy. And for an adult level user, for an adult level producer of texts in the other language, accuracy cannot be a casualty. So there should be focus on the grammatical aspects of the other language. So to bring about a clarity in perception, when meaning is concerned, the structural patterns of the two languages can be compared so that students understand the distinctions and the similarities, and it becomes easy to perceive the meaning that is available in the text. And a fundamental principle of proceeding from the known to the unknown, that has to be followed. What learners know, they know their first language. They know the ins and outs, how their first language works. They may not be able to voice, they may not be able to tell the rules, but they understand, they know the principles that are used in their first language. They are both fluent and quite a high level of accuracy is present in the first language. So that is the known. We cannot ignore what is known, because in the so-called communicative approach, earlier, the first language was not used at all. But that is banishing the known and moving into an arena of completely something which is unknown, the other language. So this pedagogy should follow the principle of proceeding from known and moving to the unknown. From known, that is the first language competency, first language skills and abilities, and to use that to access the other language competencies. And ultimately, the focus of this pedagogy using translation will be creation and transfer of meaning, because meaning is primary. If language is to be used, the one major function of language is to create meaning and to transfer meaning. That is the major function. So ultimately, translation should focus on this meaning making process and meaning transfer process, how best that can be accomplished. Right, so we're coming to a conclusion now. Now, I discussed in this presentation the role of translation in other language teaching learning at higher levels. in the light of the various positions adopted by both linguists and translation theories, and how the theoretical divide, the translation cannot function as a pedagogic tool. So that theoretical, in the communicative approach, of course, that theoretical, how this theoretical divide, which was understood to be irrevocably set, to irrevocably set translation and language learning apart, can be easily overcome to facilitate learning of the other language. Now, if we consider all these research points that are available with us, a considerable overlap actually exists. In reality, a considerable overlap exists between communicative learning strategies and the translation strategies that one can exploit for effective learning of languages and effective use of languages. That's the end of this presentation. Thank you very much. I heartily appreciate your patience in listening through this presentation. Now this presentation is open for discussion I'd request the convener to facilitate this process. If there is any questions,
Ma'am, first of all, thank you. Ma'am, thank you for your excellent speech.
Ma'am, thank you for your...
Yes, we got a question from Professor Faisal Anam. You that is there any difference between the approach and method, and which is the best one for improving language skills in English?
English. Okay. There is certainly a distinction between approach and method. Method is a tight jacket structure where everything is defined, everything is put in a stepwise manner. Do this first, do this next, do this next. That is method. Though there can be some flexibility in methods. Approaches are what somebody does actually in reality in a real classroom situation or with real life students and learners. That's an approach. Therefore, communicative, it's always called communicative language teaching has always been termed as an approach rather than a method. And methods always have a theoretical, very strong theoretical background. They are based on research and a method is created. From classroom practice also, theory develops and a method is created. But an approach is what suits a class best. An approach can be part of a method. An approach can be devoid of any method. An approach can digress from a method. So one can follow a method and at the same time, one can use diverse techniques inside the classroom that suits students' learning. For example, if somebody is using the communicative approach, or for example, let's say the structural approach. Somebody uses the structural approach and the teacher finds that some amount of interaction is required in the target language. Then the teacher deviates from the structural approach structural method to move into a different kind of approach to help students learn something better. So there are distinctions between approach and method, but there are also flexibilities. They are not tight compartments. One can be used inside the other. And your second question is, what is the best approach to teach English in English language teaching? Am I correct, Rindan? Is that the second question?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, yes.
From research and from my personal experience and my experience of discussing with many of my peers who are good researchers and good classroom practitioners, there can be no single the best method. Now, if we think about something that is the best, that has to be an inclusive method, a method that suits the learner purpose the best. What is the purpose of the learner in an English language classroom? What does the learner come to learn there? If it is at the higher education level, the purposes will be different. If it is at a secondary level, the purposes will be different. If it is for certain areas of learning, then the purposes will be different. If one person is teaching with the same purpose, the same class, that person's approach and method will be different, because the personalities of teachers will differ. And if another teacher teaches the same class with the same purpose, then the teaching method will also be a little different. So it's very difficult to mention if there is any the best method, because language, like human beings, is a very complex phenomenon, and language, like human beings, keeps on changing. So methods and approaches, they follow language, they follow classroom teaching. Language and teaching cannot follow methods and approaches all the time. So the best one is what suits the teacher best, teacher's personality, teacher's background, teacher's theoretical perspectives, teacher's attitude and assumptions, and also, more importantly, the purpose of the learners, the feasibility of classroom, whatever is practical inside the classroom. I may understand a method very well, but that I may not be able to use that in the classroom. So the feasibility perspective and the acceptance from the learner's perspective. Some learners may accept the communicative approach better. Some may accept the translation, grammar translation method better. So in my opinion, and in the opinion of many who I work with and interact with in this, in discussing research and theory, there is no so-called the best method, because that's not a possibility.
Thank you, ma'am, for your illuminating answer. I request Professor Parikal to say the vote of thanks. Professor Parikal?
Yeah. Unmute. Yeah.
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Video not necessary. Hello.
I don't think so, because your bandwidth is very low.
Okay. Yeah, I am very grateful to Professor Kalyani Samantray, because she has brought a new dimension of translation studies, which actually both the departments are also trying to develop. That's because Kalyani herself is an expert in applied linguistics, and our department specializes in applied linguistics. Therefore, this linguistic dimension of translation studies, which she has brought in, would immensely help our students, and I'm sure they would like it. For that, I thank Professor Kalyani Samantray. Then I have one more thing to say. That is, we are very sorry that several people could not join, and several people were actually removed from the Zoom connectivity. The reason is we feel that there has been a conscious effort to interrupt the talk. It started when I was welcoming and I was muted, and if I open my my video, then audio was getting muted. All these things were happening. Then a couple of times actually the speaker was continuously muted. Therefore we had to remove some of the people whose names were not figuring out. That is one thing. Then some other people, other participants, I have I have got messages from my own students. They were actually disconnected. They could not join, so we immediately sent them a message saying that you please watch the program on the Sri Sri University Facebook page. And now CALTS also started one YouTube channel. We will also upload the whole lecture there. And those who could not actually listen to this lecture, from start to end, I request all of you to visit these two, sites. That is one thing. I thank Professor Kalyani, Samantray for engaging with such a new concept of translation studies and bringing in the linguistic perspective. I'm sure this will open up many new avenues of research and collaboration between Sri Sri University and University of Hyderabad, especially the Center for Applied Linguistics and Translation Studies. I'm also and this is a sure possibility because two of my students are in your university, madam. They have joined your university. So our collaboration would be, they will help us to collaborate with each other. Okay. Then invitation. Actually, she herself is a host, but we thought that someone has to speak about the linguistic aspect of translation, because most of our speakers would speak about what I termed as a new translation studies, which is very different from the linguistic perspective. But therefore, we thought a person to bring in that particular aspect of translation. Therefore, I thank you again, Professor Samantray, for accepting our invitation and delivering that. And I also thank participants who actually wished to join but could not join, who might have actually viewed it on Facebook, etc. I thank all of them, and I would like to say sorry for those people who could not actually join this meeting today because of the either technical glitch or an deliberate attempt to interrupt this particular program. I don't know what benefit anybody will get, but on the internet such things happens. We have to accept the reality. Okay. I also thank all the authorities and colleagues applied for studies, as well as the department in the faculty. Actually, it is called the Faculty of Arts, Communication and Indic Studies of Sri Sri University. I thank Professor Rindam Kundo for doing all the difficult job, and thank you all. Thank you all. We are happy that we could manage to this lecture program today. Thank you all. Yeah, Rindam, over to Rindam.
Everyone once again. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Professor Padikal.